we're on a 100-yard march down the field and we've gone maybe 15 yards and we've got to accelerate rapidly.
Welcome to Real Transparency Talks, the series that focuses on the progress that various industry sectors are making to decarbonize our planet and highlighting some of the companies which are really putting in an effort to come clean. I'm Ryan Sheppard. I have over 20 years experience in sustainability in various roles with companies like Thomson Reuters, Refinitiv and the London Stock Exchange. And I'm joined today by Tim Nixon. Hi, Tim. Tim
Hi,
is the CEO and founder of Signal Climate Analytics, and he's going to talk to us about some of the fascinating findings from a brand new report looking at the automotive industry, but also to introduce a fantastic groundbreaking new way of tracking the emissions that really matter the most. So before we get into the report and the really interesting and somewhat challenging findings coming from that report, Tim, would you just like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the company Signal Climate Analytics?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. I used to work with journalists at Thomson Reuters and in the legal department there, and we launched an initiative maybe a decade ago around sustainability. And from that perch, after interviewing lots of executives, big companies, decided to move into the data space because I felt that while companies were a lot of times saying the right things, there was little actual data to support our understanding that they were doing the right things. So Signal Climate Analytics is the company that we're running now, and it's all about tracking the metrics that matter most on carbon intensive businesses. We feel like looking at the data, there's still an awful lot of missing data from, unfortunately, many big companies that we're focusing on today.
Thanks, Tim. And just to level set, could you give us a little bit of a background into the current state of play with sustainable investing and ESG?
Sure. Yeah, my view is pretty simple, and it's that despite very good intentions from many investors, asset owners, companies, ESG data providers, we have a bit of a mess on our hands with just the overall complexity of the ESG data world, different ratings for the same companies, just basic data quality issues. And it's maybe given the impression that we're making real progress towards measuring performance in these sectors when we haven't made anywhere near enough progress, given the urgency with which we need to measure and manage our climate to a safer, better place. So that's my top-down or bottoms-up view or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that. That gives us good background there. And specifically for the automotive sector where the report is focused, what's the sort of state of play, would you say, with the automotive sector and what they're doing?
Yeah, it's much like the other carbon intensive sectors that we're looking at. We have, looking across 30 of the largest global automobile manufacturers, we have only five, who are actually disclosing what we call the metrics that matter most, or real transparency. So they disclose the intensity of the use of their product, so the grams of CO2 that come out of the tailpipe for their global fleet. And they fully disclose their global footprint that is the total aggregate emissions from the use of all those cars and trucks every year, sometimes called Scope 3, Category 11. So there's only five that disclose that intensity metric, use that metric for forecasting, and then their absolute emissions and the assumptions that go into those absolute emissions. And that's somewhat concerning, to say the least. And if you look down the list that you'll find on signalclimateanalytics.com, you'll see that many of these 30 are disclosing little or nothing about their current impacts or plans to decarbonize. And this is a sector that represents transportation as a whole around 14% of global anthropogenic emissions, and the cars and trucks around 7 to 8%. This really matters.
Yeah, that's very clear and disappointing. There's one metric I saw in there, Tim, that looked quite interesting. It's distance traveled. And I just wonder what the significance of that is, because we have the total emissions as being a key metrics. Why do we need that distance traveled?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's a little wonky, but when companies, when they disclose their total Scope 3 emissions or their total absolute emissions from all their cars in any given year, they're using a little bit of math to do that. And one of the key parts of the mathematical equation is their estimate of how long, on average, their cars and trucks will be driven over the entire lifetime of the car. And so they use that number. Let's just say for Ford, it's 70,000 miles. And then they multiply that by the amount of CO2 coming out of the tailpipe per mile and the number of cars that they estimate are still in use at any given time. So you can see that the larger the lifetime distance estimate, the more cars at any given time are going to remain in use, and therefore the larger the total aggregate emissions number is likely to be. And so Ford is an interesting example because a few years ago, Ford was using an estimate for their average vehicle lifetime that was about half of what they currently use. And when they switched to the more realistic 150,000 mile number, suddenly their overall emissions footprint nearly doubled, which of course didn't actually happen in real life, right? It was the same cars, the same amount of emissions roughly, but just that one little change in their average vehicle lifetime distance traveled, that one little change to a more realistic number, and I give Ford credit for this, significantly changed their overall emissions numbers. We've identified these metrics that matter most that really drive the total reporting on emissions impact and emissions footprints, and that vehicle lifetime average is one of them. Only a handful of companies disclose it.
Great. Good for Ford for doing it. It sounds like the transparency around that distance traveled lifetime metric, when that sort of came out, it's probably a source of some embarrassment, I expect, and they did the right thing and revised it accordingly. So that's good to hear.
It's a good point, Ryan. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but a lot of companies might look bad when they're doing the right thing, disclosing more. And so it's important to be a savvy observer and not punish companies like Ford who are actually disclosing what many other car companies don't disclose at all.
Absolutely. That takes me to my next question, which is really, why aren't more companies disclosing these core metrics? Is it incredibly difficult for them to do, or what? Where's the challenge?
I think there's a couple things that work there. On the one hand, they're receiving many different demands for disclosure already across hundreds of data points, oftentimes from multiple ESG data providers. And there's a small army of marketing people in these companies that tries to respond to all of these different things. So there's this question of they're just getting bombarded by so many requests. But then maybe a little more cynically, you could say that process has actually produced a lot of complexity, a lot of just hard to know the forest for the trees. And that allows for not reporting the metrics that matter most, right? Because you got all these different people asking for different things. So what really matters most? So I think there's a little bit of data fatigue, but there's also a little bit of not wanting to disclose the metrics or the risks, in fact, that matter most. And then finally, on the risk sort of opportunity side for these companies, it turns out that despite all of the EV hype that we're seeing double-digit increases or triple or whatever in EVs year over year, the rate of SUV production, just the good old-fashioned gas-powered SUV, is also still going up. And those are very profitable and very polluting. So there's a business interest in keeping that story not so clear, that in fact, we're not actually making the progress that we think we may be with the introduction of the EVs.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I saw that term in the report of truckification, I think you call it. So it's a bit of a bleak picture in terms of the amount of disclosure happening in these automotive companies. Are there any positives, and what's the way forward? Where do we go from here?
I think there's certainly positives. There's clearly a movement towards electrification, especially in European and North American markets. And in China, we see some incredible innovation and leadership in EVs in startups there. Although the Chinese themselves on a national level have a decarbonization target that's in the mid 2030s for peak emissions, which is less ambitious than the Europeans and the Americans. So that's a little concerning. But I think we're saying a lot of the right things and seeing some of the right things happening. But again, getting back to the truckification theme, I think there's still way too much upside in continuing current business models. And I think with the introduction of some new regulation coming from the Europeans, potentially from the Americans and the SEC proposed rules, we may see some additional regulatory sticks coming into play. But to a large degree, I'd say we're on a 100-yard march down the field, and we've gone maybe 15 yards, and we've got to accelerate rapidly.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Tim. This has been a really fascinating insight. I think a really strong message I'm getting through is let's get back to the simple, most important core metrics and focus on getting those coming through, and then we can progress from there. So,
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and I just was on what is a core metric? We've talked about what they are in terms of transparency, but the other sort of batch of core metrics that we're focusing on is how do you measure where there's competitive advantage that's starting to emerge from a company that's decarbonizing its products and services. And that story, and we call it the sustainability ratio, where the ratio of opportunity to risk is improving for a company from sustainability. That story actually matters a lot, because if you can start to show the business case emerging in sectors for transformation, that it's providing competitive advantage, we feel that may be a story the markets can understand rather than an ESG rating.